Welcome to Satori Sounds, the podcast that invites you to unwind, relax, and explore the deeper currents of life. You'll notice, unfortunately, throughout this episode that my audio is drastically lower quality than usual, which unfortunately is due to setting up the mic incorrectly. Today, we discuss how ethics can bring you closer to your values and, in turn, foster a sense of well-being.
And I think that's what I've realized about leadership is that I thought it was about like telling people everyone what to do and learning how to control things in a way. And actually, weirdly, by giving it away, you control it better. Because if people want to do it, then they'll do it for themselves. Whereas actually, I think a lot of people don't do a lot of things because they don't like being told what to do.
I think that's a fair comment. There's a guy called Michael West, and I guess this is what we're talking about. And he talks about kind of compassionate leadership. And actually, I suppose what you're beginning to notice is actually there are elements where you need to be on the ground level with people. So you need to be noticing what's going on. And how do you kind of, not only do you then tune into what's going on, you're then motivating them to want to change it. And that's kind of what you're attempting to do, really. And yeah, just as you said it instantly, Michael West popped into my head, and I can feel it, feel it linking.
But it is, man. I think there's a lot to be said about principles for people to we talk about it a lot in this.
We do.
We go back to it, but I think a lot of leadership is that of how you can kind of show people the way, not tell them how to do it. There's a really good kind of image that I remember seeing, right? Which was like, there's a load of stick figures and they're all pulling a rope, right? And the leader is at the front helping them is at the back helping them pull the rope. And the manager is standing on the side telling them how to pull the rope.
Yeah. I think it's so one of the things that really jumps out there is not only how you kind of involved, the leader becomes, but it's the focus on the relationship, isn't it? And it's the thinking about how you preserve that relationship. And in some instances, it is that, well, I need to do this work with you. I can't just be telling you what to do. I need to be in the mud with you, kind of listening to what's going on, valuing what's going on, empathizing, understanding. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting in that regard of there's not to lead people, you have to focus on what's important to them. And by helping them realize what's important to them, but also focusing on what's important to them, you naturally get the most out of people.
Yeah, I suppose it's that element of investment, isn't it? Because, it's so funny. Like, motivation's almost contagious. Particularly when you feel that someone cares about you and they care about what they're doing. Compassion is just, it's an infectious thing. So obviously sometimes people might go the other way and they go, I don't want any part of that. But when you're sitting there and you genuinely care about a project and you care about the people you're working with around the project, that rubs off on them. Care and compassion, I should say, is like, it really is quite a motivating process. And it does drive you to do things. And I suppose it doesn't necessarily take away the challenges, but it leaves you in a position more able to, I suppose, focus on them and collectively problem solve. Whereas if you're in that kind of, I'm telling you what to do stance, you're not going to get anything from the people that you're working with, because the first thing they'll do is they'll come back and be like, well, you told us to do that. It's not worked. Now what? Kind of thing, rather than that, let's work on this together.
Right. And what's really interesting is that it's very easy to look at it inversely and go, well, what shouldn't I do? Yeah, I find sometimes when you think, well, what should I do? It's very obvious. Don't shout at them, tell them what to do, because that's not going to work.
Well,
right?
Immediately it kind of fractures by creating a psychologically unsafe environment. And, no one's going to do their best work if they don't feel, a sense of safety or, security.
Right. And so I think a lot of it comes down to having some virtues around, some good character traits that are, what we'd almost call moral, and will help excel. And I think a lot of leadership is based around virtues in that sense having some overall guiding principles and working in a virtuous way, because actually by doing that, you can really empower others.
So I think it's quite interesting because we're using terms like morals and virtues and principles, but just to, I suppose, drum it in a little bit more, give an example of what you mean by virtue in this context.
Mm. Well, I think virtues in that sense could be focusing on maybe, let's say, focusing on someone's well-being, right? Actually, so what's good for that person. You're actually taking time to connect with them in that sense of understanding what's important to them. Are you taking notice of the good things that they do?
Mm-hmm.
Are you also seeking to give feedback instead of actually, if they're not necessarily doing what you want or what they should be doing, or what you want them to be doing to be able to achieve a certain task? Are you being forthcoming with that feedback in a constructive way? For instance, by saying, well, I noticed that you did this. This part was really excellent. However, I think another way that we could have come about this would have been to achieve this. But then also opening up to what do you think? That's kind of what I mean by virtues.
Yeah, so I suppose just to summarize and give someone a label, it sounds like you're naming things like being compassionate to other people. That's a virtue. So being compassionate, being transparent. So you're not tricking people when you give feedback. Those are just kind of some things that immediately jumped out listening to what you're saying. And coming back to that idea of compassion, I once heard, and I'll be really honest, I heard it from True Detective, which is a brilliant show. If anyone's ever seen it, go and watch it. It's fantastic. But there's a moment when one character says to another, compassion is ethics. And I didn't expect to hear that, but it really resonated with me. Because the focus realistically is we through compassion, we aim to alleviate the suffering of others. And actually in that moment, when you're checking on your employee's well-being, sure, you might do it from a perspective of, well, if this person's suffering, they're not going to do their best work. But what you're realistically kind of starting to do there is go, well, actually, I don't want this person to be in distress. I don't want them to suffer when they're working with me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And picking up on your point around kind of ethics, how would you describe ethics to someone? I think we've started to unpack a bit of virtue and well-being, but I think ethics plays quite a key part as well.
Yeah, well, ethics sort of when I put on, maybe my unhelpful academic hat, I would start to kind of highlight that ethics tend to be a framework. Mm-hmm. So if you like, we often use the terms morals and ethics in kind of our general language interchangeably, but they're not necessarily the same. Or sometimes we present them together, and again, they're not necessarily the same. So morals tend to be kind of a personal view that you have internally that you've developed, and you might share that with others, whereas ethics tend to be quite external. So for instance, my governing body, Social Work England and the BPS, they've set out kind of ethical principles for me to follow and kind of ethical codes of conduct. They're not inherently my morals,
mm-hmm.
but they are kind of, if you like, centered around kind of, and I'm trying to describe ethics without using the word ethics, but they're almost like guidelines and principles, a bit like what we talk about throughout our body, to describe what to do and what you should consider when you're confronted with specific dilemmas. Whereas morals are maybe less organized and maybe kind of more internally developed, and they could be shaped by just a number of things, sort of like kind of your family values or
mm-hmm.
you name it, your own kind of personal sense of morals that you've developed through your own experiences, but they tend to be less externalized. Does that sort of answer your question there?
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think really picking up what you said there, it loops around to those principles again. I think ethics, being ethical is a very interesting question to different people. And actually, I think as you framed it with those governing bodies, like for instance, mine with the RSCS, the ethics, I think, are really good at framing that very high level, like you said, is a set of kind of overarching principles for almost a collective. And actually, I think what's interesting is that kind of ethical viewpoint, or those living within principles, has been around for generations, right? I think you could probably think of some good examples maybe off the top of your head from some historic times.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to begin to slice ethics, isn't there? You've got things like utilitarianism, which is the greatest good by the greatest number, which obviously seeks to. Well, I won't get into the the brass tacks of it, but the rough kind of idea is, well, if you can make 10 people happy, and you might make one person miserable in doing so, you should make the 10 happy, or you might kind of start to notice like ethics around kind of Kantianism, which is the idea of I suppose I've forgotten the term now, but it's basically independence and being able to make your own decisions, and kind of linked around kind of ideas of the moral imperative, which is a really posh way of saying, sometimes doing the right thing. And then you have maybe deontology, which is around kind of this sense of duty. And there's many ways to slice ethics, and there's many ethical frameworks. And I think those are just three off the top of my head. And you can kind of go way back to, say, Aristotle, who kind of came up with an idea called Nico-Mancinian ethics, which is really interesting. It's kind of talking about kind of being virtuous and how does one be virtuous. So it's quite a fascinating discussion. So these, as you said, these conversations have been around for time immemorial, and we can apply them in many different ways. A bit like, one of the things we did a moment ago was talking about leadership, and when you're guiding a team or working within a team, whether you're kind of formally the leader or not formally the leader,
Well, one of, talking to your point there about whether you are the leader or not the leader, actually, this is something that one of my old bosses really instilled in me, and it's probably one of the things that I really kept, and also I think actually really accelerated my growth, which was leadership without title. And actually,
that's a fantastic saying. Oh my goodness.
Right. And actually, you don't need to be in a position of labeled authority to be able to be a leader, and that goes back to those ethical principles, right? I almost see leadership without title as an ethical principle that I work within, right? It doesn't matter whether, what your title is or what the name is above the door, that actually, those moral principles and, being virtuous in where you can and caring for the people's well-being can be done at all levels. But I wanted to go back to your point that you're saying about Aristotle, because I think we've picked up this is now episode 3. This is the third time where we've almost gone back to this Western Greek philosophy. And something I find really interesting about kind of Aristotle in that area was that, he was guided by Socrates and Plato, who had their own differing terms, but also Aristotle then advances on what Plato does, and they also all differ. And he develops his own ideas. And I think, what you were describing around the Nico-Mancinian ethics is that actually that there was a set of his lecture notes that almost weren't out there for consumption in books, much like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, but he was using those to actually teach principles to the elites in the society to help inform others on how to live a happy and fulfilling life.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you talk, that you name it like that. It's and he actually released a second set of principles that were kind of lesser known than Nico-Mancinian ethics, and they kind of eudaimonic ethics, I think is the term. I can't quite remember, but it's less sort of spoken about by many people. But yes, I suppose what he was really, really interested in there was the ideas of generating that sense of eudaimonia. So how do we do that? And we tend to do that through actions that we just do for the sake of it, things that are just inherently important to us. Be it, and it's interesting you use the term elites, because he talks about kind of you could be this high flying, theorizing scientist, or kind of a philosophical or political kind of lecturer or whatever, or you could just be doing something simple at home, even if it's just sewing, for instance. Not that I'm saying sewing simple, because I can't sew for toffee, but that idea is actually anyone can lead this kind of lifestyle and kind of achieve that sense of eudaimonia just by contributing and doing the things that bring inherent value to them.
Well, I think that's a really good point that you bring up there around what's important to them. And I think actually what is good for one person won't always be good for another. And I think
Yeah.
actually that brings it back to well-being, really interesting in my mind, because if you're talking about well-being, within reason, a way that could be described is what is good for a person.
Mm.
Um, and maybe we throw it in this way. What are some ways that, you feel that you can, as an individual, that
Mm.
you do to improve or to help maintain your well-being? And then maybe I'll do a comparison to see whether, what's aligned and what's differs.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think I'm going to start off by introducing like the idea of well-being kind of being linked to values, and that values are almost, I like to think of them as a direction. So you never really finish necessarily heading north, if that makes sense. And you never really finish heading east or whatever direction you're going in. And when I think about things that bring me well-being, they're usually things that I find inherent value in. So things that just they bring meaning to my life. So it might be kind of, I love sports, but I love writing, I love reading, I love kind of writing stories. I love the work that I do. And I suppose it's even kind of other things like walking the dogs or spending time with people I care about. These are all things that kind of bring a sense of well-being to me as a person. And I suppose, I'm never necessarily, it's not a task that I just tick off. I'm always kind of engaging in these things, and they continually, not because I have to, but because it's just something I do almost. It's something I go, I like this. And I do it for the sake of doing it. What about you?
Well, I think to your point, just quickly on doing for the sake of doing it, it's really key. There's a really good phrase that goes that it's the journey, not the outcome. And
Yeah.
actually, that people can get really caught up in achieving, myself included. But actually, sometimes doing something for the sake of enjoyment and doing is really fulfilling. To answer your point about what does that mean for me, I think, mine's very similar in a lot of ways around books and, I love history and understanding things. Cooking for me is
Mm.
almost a meditative state. I absolutely love cooking and playing with different ingredients and understanding. We're very privileged in the world that we live in now, especially in the UK, to have access to so many different cuisines, and I love the
Yeah.
history to understand behind them. And that to me, which is such a joyous activity. Yet I'm aware to many nowadays that cooking is almost an inconvenience. People are
Yeah.
going to the opposite extreme of going, well, how can I not eat? How can I just consume without having to actually eat properly? How can I just maintain?
How can I just maintain? And it comes back to actually, that individualistic. Oh, I can't speak. God, but that kind of individual sense of this is what is important to me. We're not all the same. We all have our different value directions. And I suppose, if you're listening, one of the biggest things you can do for your well-being is begin to figure out what you inherently enjoy. Something that you don't go, oh, this is such a chore doing. Something you go, it's hard work, but I'm liking it.
Right? I think that's so important, and actually, I think that's reflecting and just listening to what we've both kind of said. I think if I was trying to maybe give some headlines of where people could focus on well-being, I'd probably say one is connect, and I mean properly connect with people, right? And we're not talking about just well, actually, we send reels to each other all the time. That's a form of connection. But really taking the time to check in with people and ask them how they're doing. We weirdly, and we've talked about this before, and it's not something to dive into now, but we've talked about it in the sense that we're so connected, but yet we feel very
So
alone.
lonely. Yeah, I think that's that's definitely a podcast topic for a later episode, and we're going to come back to that in this idea of solitude versus isolation. But I think what you're describing really beautifully is if you have a value of reaching out to others and being with others and talking to others, it's not just the idea of sending the reels and doing that superficial kind of connection. you got to start building up something there, being like, how are you doing today? What's going on for you? You know,
Right.
oh, I see that you're enjoying whatever activity that they're doing, whatever it is, just kind of slowly starting to reach out. And obviously for a lot of people, it's quite threatening to do, kind of scary, but it's something to bear in mind if you drive a sense of meaning from being with people, I think.
Massively, massively. And I think that, you know, the second bit that kind of just tags on to what you were just saying there, right? Is taking notice.
Oh yeah. We cannot just keep going on about awareness. It's just so important. Do you know what I mean? I think that's the first step to every journey. Is noticing. Even in that compassion talk. Sorry.
No, I was
cut you off.
just to pick up on that point of taking notice is so important. I just completely agree, right? Because it does tie back, and you know that's not a message we're trying to just repeat, but it shows why it's so important. You know that really is, to me, taking notice for people is a virtuous character trait. It's one of the, you know, making someone feel heard is one of the most important things I think you can do for people.
Yeah. It does come back to what we were saying earlier, that compassionate ethics and leadership. That idea of the first part is noticing that there's suffering or noticing that there's something going wrong, and the second part is being motivated to do something about it. And I feel like that's kind of just encapsulating what you're talking about there.
Massively. And I think that also, you know, hearing more, that's another one that pops up for me, is giving, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's volunteering, whether that's just helping someone out, you know, from crossing the road, holding a door open, right? Or anything through to actually, you know, undertaking a sponsored marathon. Giving back to people, I think, can really improve well-being because it comes back to that kind of connectivity.
Yeah. I think caring for someone it's almost like a co-regulating thing, isn't it? So when you help that person cross the street, as you said, or maybe you just run that marathon, the knowledge that you're doing something like that for someone else, you're helping them in some way, not only helps them to feel good, but it helps you to feel good as well. And obviously, you know, some people might be listening to this and go like, I don't value that at all. I don't care about anyone else. All I value is this. And that's fine. I think the thing that we're trying to drive home, I guess, is that idea of, you know, work out what's meaningful to you, but also consider some of these other ideas, like maybe giving, or, you know, whatever it might be.
100%. And it, you know, to that point, there's other extremes, right? Being active like that. For some people, that isn't, you know, that for them it's important well-being. I would argue that all the science points to needing to be active will improve your well-being. But for the people out there that don't think that, if that's what you genuinely feel is important and you want to follow that, then so be it. You know, I think everyone should be active in a sense, whether that's getting up, walking around the block, whether it's going on a walk with your dog. You know, I don't think we're sitting here saying you should be going cracking out David Goggins kind of style training every day.
If you're not running 30 miles a day or, you know, 60 kilometers a day, you're wasting your time. That's exactly what I'm saying. No, I'm only playing. But I think, you know, when we often think about kind of activity and physical activity, what I always like to tell people is, you know, the physical activity itself doesn't have to be the focus. So take bird watching as a really good example. You know, you're going to go out, you're going to go walking to find these spots for the birds, but the walking isn't the bit you're locked into. It just happens to be what you're doing, and you're looking at birds. And there are so many activities like that it might be, say, I'm trying to think of another example now, and I can't, but I think that's kind of illustrates my point quite nicely, in the sense of actually it's not the sole focus of what you're doing, and it's just part of it. It just happens to be part of it, but that's not why you're doing it.
100%, 100%, right? It can literally be as simple as, what do I want to go and do and enjoy, right?
I love the little smile on your face as you said that.
Because there is sometimes, right, where, you know, we can be easily so driven of just wanting to do, and actually sometimes it can be as simple as just doing what you want to do in that moment, right? And I think that ties me nicely into something I was thinking of picking up to what we just talked about, which is what I would almost frame as the opposite of a virtue, which could be described as a vice, right?
Ooh.
So actually, what we maybe call an undesirable character trait, right? So the reason I was smiling and picking up on that was because doing what you want to do all the time is a vice.
Mm.
But I do think it's important that people know that when it's right for their well-being, right? And I think maybe because we've talked about some really good examples of, connecting, being active, taking notice, keeping learning, that's a really good one as well. And giving back to people. I think we should unpack vices a little more and, not to criticize by any means, but help people maybe understand and identify what are maybe some undesirable traits and vices.
So I suppose what you're saying is, when does kind of doing the thing that gives you inherent value, when does pleasure sort of tip into that element of hedonism where you're not, it's almost harmful to you in that moment, I suppose is what you're beginning to touch on, yeah?
100%.
Yeah. I suppose one of the things that I often think about with our values, it comes back to something I said earlier, and it might be this idea of, I don't like this thing, it's hard work, but it's a value to me in the long run, and it's thinking about your longer term investment. An example might be, you might really value your dental hygiene or your health, so you go to the dentist. Now, I'm sure there are some people who love the dentist. Maybe you've got a fantastic dentist, I don't know. But you're there in the chair, they're scraping away, they're really tinkering around in your mouth. No one likes that. And actually, in your head, you're going, I hate this bit right now. But actually, when I have good health and good dental hygiene in the future, it will be worth it for me. And that's an example.
I think that's a really good example. I think maintaining your health sometimes is one of those undesirable character traits in the moment, Not like we said in the last episode, not everyone wants to go for a run on a Sunday morning, right?
No.
Not everyone wants to eat that healthier choice in the moment, but actually understanding kind of those principles of where you're going with those longer term goals is where you need to be able to kind of look to control those vices. Because actually, if you understand the bigger goal and you can act intentionally, then you can be aware of those other vices, etc., that might not be serving you. And then actually you can focus on, well, how do I be more virtuous instead of just succumbing to those vices?
Yeah, and the question might be, how do I live more in line with my values? And I suppose it comes back to just noticing kind of that intentionality that you brought up there. You sly dog, you brought it in from our last episode, and I love it. But it's that notion there of actually going to self, why am I doing this? So if I sit and eat, I don't know, 46 Mars bars, that's my record so far, listeners. If I sit and eat,
can someone do a world record check on that?
Yeah, pull that up. But if I sit and do that, at some point I have to begin to question myself, well, why am I doing this? What value am I moving toward by doing this specific action? And it's that awareness of what's important to you, and awareness of kind of the longer term investment of certain actions.
Massively. And I think it's so easy nowadays to, I think undesirable is quite an emotionally charged word, but I can't think of a better way to describe it in the moment. But
it might be unhelpful is a good way of thinking about it. So, we've all got traits and ideas or responses or behaviors that sometimes are just unhelpful, and,
right.
It could be anything. So, mine might be my unquenchable road rage. But we've all got it, and, no one's perfect. But it's noticing them.
Definitely. And actually aligning those, aligning your motives in a way as well, because if you're aware and you're working more intentionally, that you can align your actions accordingly. And I think, thinking back to what we were just talking about ethics being principles and well-being of what's good for a person, right? Actually, if you're going to fulfill both of those, it does come back to awareness once again, because you want to be able to align your actions to kind of where you want to go. And I think having the ethics and the principles for that, and I think some of the virtuous character traits can really align you in the direction that you want to go.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're really kind of thinking about those next steps. And I suppose what you're kind of identifying there is kind of what are some principles that a listener can go away and take away and think that's really important. And obviously, we're not going to give you a hardline set of principles to go and use, but an example, is the Aristotelian kind of Nico-Mancinian ethics. So that's Aristotle's kind of little compendium of ethics, or maybe Stoicism, or potentially even Kantianism. Thinking about maximizing people's autonomy. These are all kind of guiding principles, if you like. But of course, the world's your oyster. There's so much out there, and I think if I'm thinking about kind of closing steps for this episode, I'd say to people, once you have your values and once you kind of know what's meaningful to you and what direction you want to go in, it's important to remember that these aren't goals necessarily. You don't fail your values. They're always there for you to keep moving toward. And sometimes they might change, and that's okay. But it's remembering, okay, say, your values fitness, or your values kind of a career or whatever it is, you're not going to fail those necessarily. They're kind of ongoing activities that you keep developing and keep moving toward. So try holding that in mind when you're thinking about your values, when you're writing them down, or you're looking at principles, so on and so forth.
I think that's really well put, because they, in a lot of kind of ways, they're not ever totally achievable because they're not a destination, right?
Exactly.
You can live in that way, and you'll make mistakes. We all will. But actually bringing yourself back to what you've just said there is, I think, really key for the listeners to take in, is that we aren't going to always be able to achieve everything in that kind of moment. It's almost a state, actually. I think you can work towards that state. You can't maintain that state always, but you can always work towards it. And actually, I think there's some beauty of that in the moment, because if you're always focusing on the journey, you're helping to live in the present moment and just seeing how you're working through. And I think the only thing, I think you've kind of wrapped that up really nicely. I think the only thing I would probably add to maybe just bring it back in for people around their well-being, maybe. So we talked about virtuous and what that kind of means, and those ethics and different principles you can live by. But I think it's also important that people do supplement, understanding what's good for me as a person as well, right? So I've got these principles, I've got these traits, and this is how I'm going to live by them. But also, let's supplement in some things that are just good for me, like connecting with others, being active, watching your favorite video that you wanted to, right? But not over consuming to the point that it becomes a vice.
Yeah, so I suppose it comes back to that idea of balance, doesn't it? So it's kind of being like, if I, like everything as well, we try. It's difficult because we're trying not to speak in too much generality, but there is an element of generality because, to you as a listener, and even to me when I'm hearing kind of wanting to connect with people, it's that of, well, who am I connecting with? That's the important part, and you have to figure these things out yourself. It's a moment of discovery for you as an individual. And so, obviously, I think sometimes we'd love to be really specific, but the only way we can do that is by showing instances of ourselves. And actually, some of that might not be applicable to you, but as a listener, that is. And it's going away and thinking about, what is important to me. And, okay, it might not be connecting with tons of people. It might be connecting with kind of a certain group of people. It might be connecting with just one person. Or it might be, say, maybe watching that video just once, for 10 minutes, and then coming back and thinking about what you learned and so on and so forth.
Massively, I think it is. It's very hard not to say the word, and I'll say it once.
Go on, say it. Go on.
It's around intentionality.
Oh, there it is. Oh, it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Intentionality.
It really does, and I think that's the point where maybe I'll bring back in the quote from today's episode, right? Which is, the person who likes walking will walk further than the person with a destination. And I think that's something really that will now resonate a lot more with some of the listeners, right? Is that, it's not always about the destination, right? Because the destination can change, but actually, if you're doing something out of the enjoyment and it aligns with the values that you want to do, then you'll go a lot further than someone who merely has a destination.
It becomes eudaimonia, which is that fancy word that Aristotle kind of uses, obviously, to describe that sense of well-being and happiness almost, although it's not quite, doesn't quite map onto that, but yeah.
It's very aligned, isn't it?
It is. So if you've been listening, thank you. We always appreciate listeners. So if there's anything that you thought was really interesting in this episode, do feel free to like, comment, or send us a message via some of our socials. In summary, developing a sense of ethics will help lead you to values, and those are the things that are truly meaningful in your life. And when one starts to practice in line with their values, they naturally start to generate that sense of well-being. In addition, we also discuss the idea of balancing values, that there might be times where you're going to engage in activities that align with your values, but aren't necessarily what you want to do in that moment. And walking that vicarious line of virtue and vice. And yes, it did come back to a theme that we identified in a previous episode. And I'm going to say it just one more time. Being intentional. Thank you for listening.